The night poured down, heavy and unbroken. A slow drift of white breathing over every stone in Castle Black. The wind wore a thin teeth grit as it came off the frost-pale face of the wall, worrying at shutters and the edges of cloaks, rubbing men raw in a way that felt personal. Within the yard, the torches snapped and guttered. Their flames blew at the base where the cold forced itself to the very heart of things. In that reluctant light, Jon Snow stood with his gloved hands around a mug and did not drink. The broth had gone tepid, a thin skin shivering on its surface. Yet he held it as a man might hold a promise he was not certain he could keep. Ghost sat beside him like a fallen drift given thought, eyes as red and intent as coals raked close. Snow drifted on the direwolf's muzzle and did not melt. His breath steamed and curled. Every rustle drew the beast's attention. Iron pinching, harness creaking, a gate hauling up like a man dragged from sleep. "They stare when you hold a cup like that," Dolorous Ed said from behind him. It always sounded as though the world had wronged him and would do so again, and so perhaps he might as well get his humor out of it. "They'll start thinking there's poison in the broth." "If only there were," Jon murmured, and finally lifted the mug, swallowed the cooled brine and marrow. Salt and bone, oil and ash. It left a film on his tongue. He thought of what the letter had tasted like when he read it. The wax cracked beneath his thumb, the pink of the seal obscene as tongue. Bastard, 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 bastard. Ramsay Bolton's script had a madman's steadiness to it, a cruel patience in each curved letter. Jon had burned the thing in Melisandre's brazier, and yet the words clung under his nails. He carried them into every breath, every footstep, every counsel as though they were grit in his boots. "Hard to tell when I'm not tall enough to see their eyes," Ed added. "Some of us are just a fog of breath and a complaint wandering from fire to fire." Jon grunted. The sounds of the yard drifted in dull layers. A sledge dragging, a horse stamping, the scrape of a blade on a whetstone. It should have been ordinary, but the ordinary had a tilt to it tonight, as if he stood on hidden ice and any shift of weight might find a crack. Ser Alliser Thorne had looked on him that afternoon with the courteous malice of a courtier. Bowen Marsh had wrung his hands and made gentle requests. "Lord Commander, reconsider, Lord Commander, you must not," until the requests had the sound of a prayer and the ache of a knife. "Ed," Jon said, not turning, "how many men were in the mess at first bell? Enough to call it many, and not enough to call it bold." "Why?" "Because Wick Whittlestick asked me to come see a thing in the yard," Jon said. "He said it was urgent. He said your Uncle Benjen had been found," Ed finished flatly. "Because men are always found alive after they've been gone beyond the wall in deep winter. The dead write home, my mother used to say. Ghost, tell him to go. I'm too weary." Ghost flicked an ear. Jon set the mug aside and toyed with the strap of his glove. "I ordered the wildlings to be housed within the new keep until the last of them passes. I told Tormund we would hold the gate open as long as we dared. Bowen says I mean to make raiders of them in black cloaks. Men struggle to love neighbors they can see. Ask them to love strangers and they lose their wits. Ser Alliser thinks it treason. Ser Alliser thinks an unsharpened spoon is treason if it's not in his hand," Ed said. But the dry voice had weight underneath it. "Where do you want me?" "Close," Jon said, and finally turned. The torches cast Ed's long face in a wavering amber that made his eyes deep hollows, as iron on a helm. "If I am summoned to any urgency, you come beside me with 4 men of your choosing." "No." 6, and fetch Tormund. I'll have raiders in black cloaks around me, then." Ed blinked. "You mean to go to this urgent thing, then?" "I mean to walk the yard of the castle I command." He slung his cloak closer, felt the familiar rasp of Longclaw at his hip, the drag of Valyrian steel as if the sword had a gravity of its own. "If I hide, I might as well die. And if I go alone, I might as well hurry it." Dolorous Ed sighed, the long sigh of a man who had to be brave again after having been brave all day. "I will. One more offense against common sense for the tally. I'll fetch the Free Folk chief. He's warming his backside near the kitchens and telling lies. Tell him there will be better lies later. John put a hand to Ghost's ruff. The dire wolf rose without a sound, broad and soft-footed, and the two of them crossed the yard together into the wind. The summons came before they reached the center. Wick Whittlestick appeared from a shadow like a fish from dark water, eyes bright and fixed. He pointed. There, my lord. We found him, gods be good. We found him. Ghost made a noise that was not a growl and not a whine, a sound like a bowstring thrumming and a snare tapping at once. John felt it in his ribs more than he heard it. He glanced at Wick. No snow clung to the boy's cloak. The wind had not found his hair. He had not been outside. Hold, John said, and stopped of a sudden so that Wick checked himself and then forced excitement back upon his face like a man shoving on a glove that did not fit. John looked beyond him. The yard lay plain, powdery with new fall. No track, but there's marred it. Where is he? John asked. Wick pointed again, but the motion had lost some of its zeal. We inside. They brought him inside, my lord. There was no time to. Ed had said 6 men, and Ed was a man to count. John heard the steps before he saw them, the weight and scrape of boots coming, hands on hilts by the sound of leather creak and metal hum. Tormund Giant's Bane strode beside Ed as if he owned the snow by right, orange mane ice-crusted, eyes amused and then narrowing, amused and then not. Big Crow, Tormund rumbled. You call, I come. Who wants to kill you tonight? Best we do it kindly and quick. Save them the chore. Something in the yard settled at that, as if a bird that had been poised for flight decided to sit very still. Ser Alistair Thorne's voice came from the dark of the hall mouth. His tone had respectable weariness to it, polished to serve. Lord Commander, you're needed. You sound tired, Ser Alistair, John said. I am tired of ignoring wrongs, and it is I who should say that title. Lord Commander. Come. Bowen Marsh stepped into the light next to Thorne, face melancholy. His hands twisted upon each other as if each sought to protect the other and found only guilt in the meeting. Othel Yarwick was behind them, jaw set in a way that told of the decision already made. And between their shoulders, eyes too bright, mouth a tight wound. Ollie, the rookery boy John had taught to draw string and feather an arrow. The winter drove his breath out, and John could see every thought he had ever had drift up pale before him. He had loved them, these men, not like brothers by blood, but like brothers by frostwork and vow and watchfire. He had expected, in some stubborn chamber of himself, that love would do what orders could not. He reached for that chamber, found it empty, and shut the door. What do you need of me? He asked. To see justice done, Thorne said. Justice for the dead you've brought across the wall. Justice for our murdered brothers at Hardhome. Justice. Hardhome was no murder, Tormund cut in. Hardhome was ice and wind, and the dead the South let men forgot. Your justice is a knife sharpened on your own fear. Thorne's hand twitched as if to lay upon his sword, and then did not. He had controlled his hate long enough to make it seem a principle. That sort of habit was not easily undone. You open our gates to savages. You pour our stores down their throats and call it mercy. You speak of our oaths as if they were a shroud we might fold back when we grow hot. You speak of war in the South, Bolton and Stark and pink letters and chained wolves, and think to drag the watch behind your name. That is treason dressed as pity. Bowen Marsh swallowed. Lord Commander, if you would only put aside this fancy of marching, perhaps all might yet be. I will not march, John said, and watched in the breath that followed the shape of relief form and crack. Nor will I break my vow. I wrote the orders and set them aside. The men who would go south will not do so under the cloak of the watch. I will not be the thing I hate. Bowen blinked, and in his eyes some half-formed plan flickered and faltered. Thorne's did not. Thorne had not contrived for what John would do, but for what he had done. And yet, he said softly, you have already betrayed us. You have already swung our oath like a door to let the wild in. You! John lifted a hand and the words died as if the wind had snatched them. A hunter quieted his hound so. He kept his hand high, palm outward so all could see it empty. His voice he kept level. "You will speak your grievance in the hall," he said. "You will speak it before men I trust and men who do not trust me, and you will speak it where a table stands between us rather than a knife. You will not lay a snare in my yard for my grief." Thorn stared at the clean snow between them as though it contained the exact shape of John's heart, and he could not decide where to strike. Wick Whittlestick moved. It was swift, born less of skill than of desperate certainty. He was 3 quick strides and a lunge, knife low and mean for the gut beneath the mail. But Ghost had been born for swiftness and hunger, and he came like weather, soundless and huge. His jaws closed on the boy's wrist, and bone popped audibly. The knife fell and skittered across the snow. Wick screamed, and then the scream turned to a high keening as Ghost shook him once and let go. White fur misted red in a spray. The sound pulled other sounds in its wake. Boots drumming, steel half-drawn, curses, the wet choke of a man who had swallowed his courage wrong. "Hold!" John roared, and it broke through the yard like N or through ice. "Hold, by the gods you claim to serve. Ed!" "Here," Dolorous Ed said, and his 6 were already moving, not to cut down but to hem in, shields to the fore. Tormund laughed, a terrible thing when there was no mirth in it. "Blood was coming whether you called for it or no," the wildling said. "Best it's theirs." Thorn's face had gone very still, like a man at last beyond the lie he had told himself. Bowen Marsh had paled to the color of the snow around his mouth. Ollie stared, breathing quick little puffs. He saw John's eyes and hated him for finding him. Yarwick's fingers had drawn his sword half out before sense returned to them, and they pushed it home. "Arrest them," John said. "Sera liser torne." Bowen Marsh, Athel Yarwick, Wick Whittlestick, and any other who raised hand to draw steel at a brother's back. Step forward if you're eager to taste the inside of a cell. For a long heartbeat no one breathed. Men do not believe in the moment of their own unmasking. They believe in the next feint, the next word that will set a clock back 3 minutes to where it was simpler. Then Ed's men moved, and Tormund moved with them, and the men who had believed in the next word instead found iron on their arms and their shoulders. Thorn did not struggle. He lifted his chin to give them room for the shackle, and in that small courtesy was all the dignity he had left. Bowen wept soundlessly, tears squeezing out like thaw under a door. Yarwick cursed in a lover's voice under his breath. Wick, cradling his ruined wrist, spat blood and fear. In the hall, the fire snapped. Melisandre watched with eyes that did not seem to blink. She had turned the pink letter to ash in that fire 2 days ago and had looked satisfied, as if a particular knot in the tapestry of the world had been smoothed. Now she appeared to look through John and the men behind him to something colder. "You will need the god of fire when the god of death drinks deep," she said as they brought the traitors in. Davos Seaworth, grimmer for want of sleep, stood at her shoulder and looked less through and more at. "What he'll need," Davos said, "is honest meat and a bed without knives. But if that's not on hand, a stout door with a bar will do to start." There were protests and denials and a few bold lies. There were men who swore on oaths they had spoken with John, oaths that had never been. There were lists of grievances that had the sound of truth and the stink of convenience both. John sat. He listened. He held himself as the old bear had, and when he felt his temper open like a door in a storm, he shut it and piled his will against it. He had asked for the thing that made it harder, and so he would bear it. At the end, it came down to what it had been at the start. Oaths had meanings. Snares were not trial. Murder was not the same as sharpness. He could have lanced the boil by naming the word he had not spoken, treason, and putting his seal to it, but he did not. He named instead a breaking of the peace, a plotting of violence against the Lord Commander, the endangerment of the Watch's common weal in a time of grave peril. He named enough that the punishment could be what it must be, without stealing the word that men would twist. He named the names. "Tomorrow," he said to Ed at the last, when the prisoners had been taken to the ice cells and the men had been dismissed to their whispers. "No, not tomorrow. At dawn." "Dawn and tomorrow are regrettably the same thing," Ed said. I'll set the scaffold. No scaffold, John said. He thought of a boy in another winter standing stiff-backed while his father spoke of what a man owes the men he commands. He thought of a man's arm rising and falling and snow taking in the blood discreetly, without comment. There will be a beam and a rope for those who have earned it. There will be a block for the men whose titles demand it. And there will be a sword. Mine. Ed's eyes, deep and tired, opened a little wider. He said, I'll tell the cook to make the sausages smaller. If you're to do all that swinging, you shouldn't be weighed down. Word travels in ways that have nothing to do with ravens or messengers. It went on the black wind and on the dry, rasping breath that lay over Castle Black like a sheet. Men did not sleep well. In one of the new keep rooms, Sansa Stark lay very still with her hands over her stomach and listened to the snow beat soft against the shutters like a hand that had not learned how to knock. Brienne sat on a stool just inside the door with her sword laid across her lap and her head tilted as though she heard other sounds than Sansa did. She had not objected when Jon told her there would be a hanging and a headsman's sword in the dawn. She had only looked at Sansa and then at Jon in a way that said she would like the world to be less ugly for the girl's sake and knew it would not be. Will you go? Sansa whispered now. Brienne shook her head. You need me here. She hesitated. Do you want to go? I don't know what I want. Sansa breathed in, breathed out. Her breath was a pet she hoped not to wake. Once I wanted songs to be true. I want my brothers to be alive. I want Winterfell whole. She tasted iron. I want him to be safe. Brienne did not reply. It was the kindest thing she could have not said. The dawn came pale as bone and very still. The snow had spent itself in the night and left the world a carved thing. Edges softened and meanings stark. Jon dressed in silence. He tucked a mail shirt beneath black wool and tied his cloak close. When he lifted Longclaw from its rack, the sword's rippled steel caught what little light there was and made something like water over the grain. Ghost paced and then sat, pacing and sitting, ears moving through a narrow dialogue with a world only he could hear. In the yard, a rope hung from the beam they had used for lifting crates and barrels, and once a wagon wheel when no other tools would do. Beside it, Ed had set a block on a square of melted snow that had refrozen, the ice faintly glassy where men had walked around it, uncertain of where to put their feet. Tormund stood with the free folk within sight, but not so close that any nervous hand could name it intimidation. The brothers of the Night's Watch were gathered in their blacks like the crows they were called. An unhandsome murder of men who had found in the vow something to carry when they could carry little else. The condemned were brought forth. Thorne walked with calm bitterness, as if he had become at last the man the world had accused him of being, and found it fit more easily than he had hoped. Bowen Marsh's steps were small and faltering, tears already making clean tracks on his cheeks. Othel Yarwick licked his lips as if searching for a last argument and found only dry mouth. Wick Whittlestick cradled a bound wrist and stared wildly at the rope, then at the block, then at Jon. Ollie came last, light as a boy always seems when led to something heavy. The hate that had been on his face burned low now and dull, banked ash in which an orange coal might still be found if the wind took it right. Jon mounted the low platform Ed had made of planks and barrel tops. He stood a moment and let the yard become itself around him, like a man waiting for a skittish horse to accept his hand. You know why you are here, he said, no louder than he had to speak. The morning took his breath and laid it thin. His voice carried because all the others were not speaking. You plotted against your Lord Commander in a time of peril. You sought to shed the blood of your own when there is too little warm blood left for any soul in the world. You would have murdered me to keep the watch from doing its duty. I say to you now, and to the men who watch, the duty of the watch is to the living. We hold the wall for the living, and we feed the living, and we take in the living when the dead hound them, because we stand on the edge of the world and call ourselves men. Thorne's mouth twitched. You are no man I would be, he said. Take your sermon to the wildlings you call your brothers. Jon looked at him a long moment and heard his father in his blood. The man who passes judgment must look upon the man he kills. I will not speak to you again, he said. Bowen Marsh, Othel Yarwick, Wick Whittlestick, Alistair Thorne. Whether you call it treason or folly, This is the cost. Ali. He paused, and found the place in himself where anger had burned. He pressed the heel of his hand there until it hurt. Ali, you are young and you have lived on winter's wrong side. You have seen worse things done than any ought, and in your hunger you reached for a poor understanding of justice. But the watch will not be saved by a child's hand turned murderer in a corner. Ali did not cry. That frightened John more than any tears would have done. He did not ask if they had last words. It would have been theater and unkind, and he had had enough of both. He set Wick first to the rope because Wick had the terror in him that moves quick and cuts slower men in its flailing. He would not have him watch and strain against bonds until he became a danger to men and to himself. It tied the knot. Wick made a sound between prayer and curse, and then another when the barrel kicked and the rope took him. The yard watched his boots dance and watched them still. The silence after seemed deeper for the brief, ugly music. Othel Yarwick had been a builder all his life and had believed perhaps that a thing could be made to be fairer by the clever joining of TW. Uyu mached beans. He knelt at the block out of habit more than penitence, and John took his head in one clean stroke. Valyrian steel bit deep. Longclaw came away with a soft tug and the blood steamed in the dawn cold like a flawed prayer. Bowen Marsh collapsed to his knees of his own accord and sobbed. He tried to say John's name and could not. He tried to say Lord and could not. He looked up once, as if seeking from John some last reprieve of which both of them knew he was not worthy. John set his mouth. He swung. When Bowen's body slumped forward, it did so with peculiar gentleness, like a pillow thrown by a child who has not the heart to truly throw. All that while Thorn had stood like a statue of some harsh god. When they brought him to the block, he did not kneel at first. He looked at Ghost instead, and then at John, and in his eye there was the first flicker of respect John had ever seen there. Honor turns strange in men born bastard, Thorn said. Do it well. John did. The blade sang and spoke in one voice, a tone that told of the oar's making and the forge's temper and the hand that held it now. When Thorn's head rolled, the world did not change its angle or catch its breath. The snow accepted, the rope swung, the flame flinched and steadied. Ed's men made their grim inventories. Tormund spat and said nothing. Some of the brothers stepped forward to see. Some turned away. Ali was last. He would not close his eyes. John wished for him to close them, if only so John might tell himself there was some kindness left to offer. He had taught the boy to loose an arrow and to straighten his back and to mend a fletch with glue and patience. He had not taught him the better things, the large and slow ones that took more time than any winter would grant. I was wrong, John said softly, and did not know if he spoke truly or because he needed to say something he could live with when night came. I was wrong to let you bear a man's weight before you had a man's back. I was wrong to think what we suffer makes us clean. It only makes us poor in other ways. But I will not let you make of your pain a knife for my brothers. He lifted Longclaw. He swung. When it was done, there was no cheer, no cry, no ragged roar of men letting something go. There was only the work that follows any stern task. The cleaning of steel, the untangling of rope, the lifting and carrying, the heating of water, the rubbing of stiff fingers. John washed Longclaw himself with snow and melted water. The blade's ripples moved beneath his cloth as if the steel had a tide. He thought of how many heads the sword had taken in the centuries behind him. He wondered what stories those men had told themselves before the end. He wondered what story he would tell himself when all the words were gone. By noon, the yard looked ordinary again. That was the worst of it. The winter wore all deaths alike, a white hood over everything that had been particular. Ghost slept in a corner of John's chamber like a banked fire. Sansa came and stood in the doorway and did not enter until he nodded. She had on gray wool, good heavy cloth with a new belt he recognized from the smith's yesterday. She looked like Winterfell in a way that hurt. "Thank you for not asking me to watch," she said. "I would not have had you remember it in detail," he replied. "I will remember it anyway." She drew her hands together at her waist and looked for a place to put them down. Found none. Let them rest together. "You did it because you had to. I used to think that was simple. It isn't, is it?" It is simple, John said. It is only not easy. They will say you killed your brothers. They will say many things. John dragged a hand through his hair. His fingers found the grit of ice near his temple where sweat had frozen. Some will say I killed the watch. Some will say I saved it. The dead won't say anything, which is the best I can offer them now. Sansa came closer so that he could see the fine work on the leather of her belt, the small stitch that had gone astray and been rescued by a neat backstitch. I am going to take Winterfell back, she said bluntly, with the courage of a frightened person who has decided fear has had enough of her. I will have it, with you or without you. It should have been a relief to hear the steel in her voice. It nettled him that it hurt instead. With me would be easier, he said. You're right. You have a vow. I have a vow, he agreed. He closed his eyes briefly. I have a vow and the dead. I meant to break one or abandon the other. I am done trying to do both and calling it kindness. She put a hand on his arm, pale fingers against black wool. If I send to the north, some will come, she said. If I send to the Vale, Littlefinger says he will come. I don't know if I believe him. I don't know if I should. But he has knights and I have a name. And perhaps between those two wearing their best faces, we might contrive a third thing true enough to swallow. Send, John said. Send to Lyanna Mormont. She is 10 and fiercer than the wind. Send to the Glovers and the Hornwoods and the Manderleys. They love history more than justice, and your name is older than any injustice Ramsay has done. Send to the mountain clans, and ask Tormund to lend you men. She blinked. Can he? He is free folk. He can do as he pleases. He remains here because I asked him to, and because the dead make him honest. But if he chooses to go south at your side, that is not the Watch marching on Winterfell. That is Tormund Giantsbane giving the Boltons his opinion. Her mouth quirked, a ghost of a smile he had seen on other faces once. If I were a Bolton, I would pay money not to hear that opinion. I'll ask Davos to go with you. He knows Lord's words and ways. He'll keep your quarrel from turning into a feast for their appetites. You will not come, she said, and did not make it a question. He looked at Ghost, the white flank rising and falling, and felt how badly he wanted to break everything he had built and run south with a sword and a name. He saw himself as a boy in Winterfell's yard on a day clear and cold when ice broke under the heel and the ravens called, and he wondered if he would ever be a man worth the words he put in his own mouth. I will not come, he said softly. I will hold the wall. I will hold it until my hands break, and then I will hold it with my teeth. When you take Winterfell, send me men to garrison Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower. Send me grain. Send me the truth, no matter how bad. But do not send me songs. She drew a quick breath and nodded once, brisk as a decision made. All right. Then, after a beat, you cut a child's head from his body today. I did, he said. I wish you had not had to. So do I. She leaned forward and kissed his cheek. Her lips were cold. It should have felt like comfort. It felt like a benediction given before a march that might not end. When she left, Brienne rose from her stool and went after her, and the room lost a kind of watch it had been keeping. Davos came before the sun gave up altogether. He smelled faintly of smoke and salt and the old fish that never truly leaves a man, no matter how many years he has lain ash-free in winter. You'll have me south with the girl, he said without preface. I liked Stannis in the fashion of men who respect a ruin for the work it took to build it. But I like Starks better. They hold things without making a song of it. Keep her alive, Jon said. I will. The old smuggler gave him a long look, measuring grief and anger as if they were cargo and he had a ship just barely large enough to carry them. And you, lad, I will keep the dead from stepping over our bones, Jon said. Good. Then we'll see each other again. Davos thrust out a hand. Jon took it. The fingers were blunt and warm and earnest in a way that had little to do with gods. Tormund came when the light had turned the pale of birch bark. He filled up the doorway and then the room and then the notion of the room. He made spaces feel like stories one told less for truth than because the words were hot. Little Bird says you want me to take my men south, he said. You tell me what to do, Big Crow? I ask, John said. Do as you please. What I please is hitting a man who ties a woman to a thing and calls it a wedding. I've not the sort of patience their gods ask. Tormund scratched his beard until frost dusted down like crumbs. I'll go. I'll keep your girl alive if I can and kill trophies if I cannot. And I'll send you a prize. Heads full of lies and a cart of grain. It's the best I can think to do. It's more than most, John said. It's more than clever, which is why I like it. Tormund's grin flashed and was gone. He thumped a fist against John's shoulder, a blow that might have knocked down a less ready man. Do not die while I'm gone. It would be ill-mannered. I'll try to have manners. They went at foglight 2 mornings later, Sansa and Davos and Brienne and Tormund and 200 free folk who did not ask to be paid in anything but the chance to turn hurting back on its masters. Ghost watched them go with a low sound like hunger. Jon stood on the outer stairs and breathed the ice while they dwindled to pricks of movement and then lines and then nothing. The wall loomed above him like an old god's shrug. He had thought to march beneath it once. Now he would be the thing that did not move. The days that followed settled into a new grammar of alarms. Ravens came, bellies tight with messages that smelled of wax and fingers. The men drilled twice daily, then 3 times when the wind cut crueler and the blood wanted sitting. He sent wildling trapsmen north of the Bridge of Skulls to lay snares that the dead could spring and the living learn from. He sent builders to Eastwatch with iron and timber to brace a gate none of them trusted. He sent Dolorous Ed to the Shadow Tower to tell Dennis Mallister that whatever old hurt he had against Castle Black, he must put it down as a man puts down the cup when the house catches fire. He slept little and ate less. The yard's noises became a litany he could kneel in. Iron sing, boot crunch, raven croak, man cough, wind speak. At night the wall groaned softly as ice shifted against itself, like an animal old and too wise to complain. In the small hours he would rise and lay a hand on Longclaw's pommel and think without words until the cold had taken enough of him that he felt cut down to something lean and dependable. Snow came and then a clearness that made the stars violent. In that clearness Melisandre climbed the inner stairs to the wall and stood beside him without a sound that he could hear. She had a way of making his skin notice her before his eyes did. The red at her throat burned steady. The night has a face, she said. I had forgotten how handsome it could be. Kings look handsome too, Jon said. It doesn't make them good. You killed men because you must, she said. I have killed for a false understanding of the same word. Duty. It tastes like iron and blood no matter who seasons it. She tipped her face to the stars. I see the dead move. I see their shadows long as spears. I see a gate and a breaking. I see. She paused, the red to her neckline deepening as if it hurt her and knew more than she did. I see your name like a coal under the ash. I cannot say if the fire is out or waiting. Say nothing then, Jon said. Watch. She did. In her stillness, he found a sort of blasphemous companionship. The night did not change. That frightened him more than if it had done some miracle. The first alarm came 3 days after the moon turned its thin face. A raven from Eastwatch beat itself against the wind and fell in the yard like a stone, legs tangled in thread. It wore no tube. The words were tied to its leg in a clumsy knot with rawhide, as if a hand that had not yet learned how to be gentle had been taught quickly. Ed cut the strip and flattened the damp paper. Men gathered close to see and then drew back because they remembered they had names. Jon read, blue in the water, bones on the shore. The things that walk do not tire, need fire, need men, need. The last word trailed to a blot. Jon heard the sea hiss in his memory. He knew Eastwatch's smell. Salt and tar and rotting rope and gulls' dirty courage. He could see the long line where the shivering sea met a shore that had learned resignation the way a face learns its wrinkles. He folded the paper and set it on the table as if it were a map he had memorized and did not need to see again. We go, he said. Dolorous Ed rubbed the bridge of his nose. I have never liked water, he said. I was born to fear it, and the fear has done right by me so far. I suspect the time has come to change that habit. Leave a garrison, Jon said. 40 men at Castle Black. 20 at the Shadow Tower if Dennis won't send more. Arm them with dragon glass and oil. Melisandre, can you spare fire? I have all the fire the god grants me, she said. Whether he grants it in the places you wish is not a thing I can promise. Promise to try, Jon said. They went in a long snake of men and drag sleds. Free folk and brothers, ghost weaving along their flank like the thought of a hunt. The cold made a noise men could mistake for silence. It was not. It was teeth within the wind. Their breath went up and came down in rhyme on their beards and lashes. The day's light had a trick of making distances lies. Jon kept the line moving and tried not to look too often toward the far brightness that never seemed nearer. At Eastwatch by the sea the world smelled different. The salt came like a hand slapped to the face. The wall descended into the water with a grace that mocked itself. Ice met sea and the sea ate and could not be done. The watchmen there were grim-faced and hollow-eyed, and they lit their signal fires in a hurry when Jon came because hurrying felt like purpose. Out beyond, on the gray chopped skin of the water, things moved. At first Jon took them for bergs, afloat, small gods set loose to drift. Then one turned, and he saw the pale shine of limbs, the way the sea lifted and set down what should not stand in it. Fire, he said, and the word spread along the parapet like a boy running. Pitch pots flew, arced, fell and smashed. Flame flared and also died too quickly where the water licked at it. Melisandre stood, hair torn loose by the wind, and spoke soft words whose meaning was not in the sounds. The next pitch burned harder. Men shouted. A drum rattled and then another. The dead did not look up as men would have it noise or fire thrown at their faces. They came steady, a march that the sea itself did not alter, water filming their chests, freezing in the hollows of their throats, falling and freezing again. An arrow from the parapet took one in the eye and did what arrows do to dead men. It made a gesture of the head and told nothing to the heart. A pot of oil hit two at once and set skinless hands alight. They burned until they reached water, and the fire hissed and died, and the hands came again. Dragon glass, Jon shouted. Spears front. The spears did what fire could not. Where obsidian bit bone it left a word in the air shatter that had the relief of truth. The dead broke, but they came in their numbers and the numbers did not care about truth. The shore became a slick mess of ash and melted ice and bits of men and not men both, and the tide claimed the worst of it without comment. They fought until dawn bullied the dark aside, and in that ugly light Jon saw them, out beyond the surf. A thin black rake of shadows upon the ice floes farther north, too tall to be men, too still to be anything but the riders of what was to come. The others did not attack. They watched. Jon felt their attention like the notice of a lord who has decided which of his hounds will run, and which will breed, and which will be killed for spite. Ghost stood with his fur bristling along his spine, eyes intent, and made no sound. Melisandre's breath streamed red in his mind because he had no better color to give it. They will test the wall, she said softly. They have found their nerve again. They will test us, Jon said, and they will find we do not break as soon as the things they have to hand. They have had time to learn patience, she said. You have had time to learn stubbornness. We will see which is the finer teacher. They held Eastwatch for 5 days, and in that time the dead came twice more in waves and broke there, and the others watched once and did nothing that men could write down in ink. On the 6th day, a raven came with Sansa's neat hand and Davos's coarser words beneath it. Winterfell reclaimed, Ramsay dead, the Stark banner in the wind, grain pledged, men to come, send needs, send names, send hope if there's any left to spare. Jon stood on the parapet and read it 3 times. He could smell his sister in the shape of the letters, that part of Winterfell that had been courtly and careful and had still found room to wear soft shoes in the godswood. He turned and showed the letter to Ed, to Tormund, to Melisandre. The men cheered, a weak, winter-bitten brook of sound, but honest. Good, Tormund said. I am too pretty to die north of a place I have helped win. You are a liar who flatters yourself, Ed said. We will bury what's left of your vanity with military honors. John wrote back with fingers that had gone stiff from the cold. "Send carts," he told her. "Send iron. Send every man who can hold a spear and does not fancy himself a bard. The dead are on the shore. We have met them and held. We will hold again. Tell the Mormonts I remember their strength. Tell the Glovers I remember their absence. Tell the Hornwoods I remember their hunger. Tell the Vale to stop wearing its courtesy like armor and bring the knights where they can see what it is they pretend to defend. And at the end, quick as a man catching his breath between two waves, be safe. I will not come, but I am there." Winterfell sent what it could and more than most would have done with less. A line of wagons bobbed north under wolf banners that made men on the King's Road step aside and stare and think about how names become weather. With them rode men with half-remembered oaths on their lips and new ones learning the path to their tongues. A dozen Mormont girls came with spears twice their height and faces as serious as tacksmen. A handful of Glover men rode with shoulders set, their shame unspoken but clear. The Vale riders came last, polished and neat as a lie told by a priest. They bent their knees to Sansa's letter and not to Jon's, but their swords still cut when they came to learn the killing the dead ask. Jon set them to the castles along the wall like stones in a dike. He let their lordlings argue about who stood where until their vanity burned off as cleanly as snow under a hard sun. He put wildlings at each place, men and women who had learned how to live with too little and could teach that lesson to soldiers whose belts had always been tight for show and not necessity. He set Ed to Rotes and Tormund to the drills that had worked in a life before men had walls to do their thinking for them. He set Melisandre to the fire pits and the oils, and he watched her work with a caution that grew into a strange respect, the respect one has for a blade one would rather not have to use. When the others came in truth, they did it in the honest way of storms. A long threat, a brief calm, and then everything at once. The first thing was sound. Not the horns, not the shouts. A thin, clean note like glass being sung by a finger. It ran along the wall and down into the stones of men's teeth. Ghost lifted his head so sharply his neck cracked. Jon felt the sword in his hand before he remembered having taken it up. They came out of the night like a negative of men. Where men produce warmth and shadow equally, they brought perfect lines of cold. The dead came with them in a tide that did not tire. The men at Eastwatch blew horns until their throats bled, and the horns at Castle Black answered, and the Shadow Tower's old, iron voice came too, bellies of great beasts turning and calling. The gates were shut. The chain on the hoist creaked like a prayer spoken too often. Torches flared and died and flared again. On the ice face of the wall, where a man could stand if he trusted his boots more than his mother, men stood and watched the height of the fall they would take if they failed. Jon moved as a hand moves in a known task. He did not think. He was thought. He put men where the wall's curves would help them and where the dead's clever lack would betray them. He sent out sledges loaded with pitch pots and men with thick arms to throw them, then sledges to drag the empty sledges back. He saw another only once, nearing dawn when the wind did a particular thing to the sound that made the hair on his neck crawl. It was taller than any man there and thinner, as if some expense had been spared in its making. Its eyes were the cold one goes mad trying to describe and so calls blue because there is no other way to speak of them. It lifted a blade that looked like frozen breath, and a man 2 paces from Jon raised his spear of dragonglass, and the two things touched. The sound they made will live in Jon's ear when the rest has gone. It was not a shatter. It was a word a god would speak to end a world. The spear broke, and the man broke with it, the cold running up his arm as a look of surprise ran over his face. A surprise that this, too, could be in a world that had already shown him so much. Jon stepped in. Longclaw met the thing's blade and slid. Valyrian steel and something older complained together. The other turned, precise as a dancer, and aimed to cut Jon from hip to shoulder with the economy of a craftsman. Jon gave it the smallest part of his life and twisted. Longclaw's ripples took the light the way water does before a lightning strike. The blade bit. The other shattered like a frost sculpture under a drunkard's heel. The shards went to snow. The cold in the air flexed and then loosened slightly. Men shouted for a reason other than terror and work. The dead around that place faltered, then found themselves again. No wonder, John thought with a short, hot lightness like a laugh. Something in the mind of the tide had been taken from it, and the water had hesitated, as if trying to remember who had told it to come. The battle had no clean end. It trailed off as so many men died that even the dead's appetite was sated for that window of hours, and the others chose not to try the wall itself with whatever power they were husbanding for some later day. When the dawn finally decided to own the sky, the yard below Eastwatch was a ragpicker's field. John stood among the living and counted them, then among the dead and counted them too, because numbers are a kind of prayer that gives the hand something to do while the heart waits to be told what it must carry. They buried men and burned what would burn, and watched the dead, who would have risen, not do so because their masters had been too careful of themselves this time. John wrote Sansa with his hands wrapped in cloth against the cold, and told her what she could bear to know. She wrote back, a longer hand than before, as if her breath had grown easier. The North rallied. She spoke of lords learning to share bread and an awkward bench in the same room, of Brienne standing like a mountain and not bothering to move because mountains are never asked to. He did not write of Ollie. He did not write of Thorne's last words or of Bowen's tears. He did not write of the boy from Barrowton who died with his eyes wide because he had never seen the sea and had been surprised that it justified all the stories men told of it. He wrote of rope mended and gates braced and fire burning where it ought. He wrote of Ghost's white shape slipping through drifts and returning with his muzzle ruddied and his eyes full of whatever it is wild things understand. He wrote of the wall holding, when he could no longer push himself to remain upright. He slept and dreamed of Winterfell. In the dream it was summer, which made him ashamed when he woke. Shame is a safe luxury, they say, when blood is warm and duty met. It wearies quickly when either runs short. Men came to the watch who would not have come before. A Manderly man with a fish on his banners and a new way of looking at wildlings in his eyes. A Crannogman who spoke rarely and smiled when he did as if it hurt and was worth it. A reed boy too young to be there and too stubborn to be stopped by any man who did not wish to be bitten for his trouble. Girls from Bear Island who took to the wall with a fierceness that made old men shake their heads and say that the world had turned, and perhaps it had decided to show its better face for a change. They turned out in the yard in rows that were not pretty but were honest, and they learned slowly and almost gladly, because the thing they were learning would be of use, and most learning is not. Once, on a day so bright that the ice itself looked faintly blue at the edges, John stood with his hands clasped and watched them and felt a lightness that was not happiness but some shadow of it. The kind a man allows himself when it occurs to him that his labor has a shape others can see. Dolorous Ed came to stand beside him and did not speak, because he had learned a kind of silence that was almost a compliment. Tormund tromped up after, scowled at the rope work, and shouted at a girl for tying a knot wrong. She shouted back with language that would have made a sailor blink. Tormund grinned and told her she would be prettier when the dead chewed off her ears and left the rest. Melisandre watched from the shadows again, or perhaps he only expected her to in any place where fire was near and so imagined it. The red at her throat seemed less of a thing she wore and more a thing that fed on her. She caught his eye and came, and for a moment he thought she would say again the words about light and darkness that gave him both strength and an ache. She did not. She stood beside him and watched the practice and then said, "You placed your hand in the mouth of a winter and did not draw it back when it bit. That is the first of courage. The second is not leaving it there to be devoured. Send men south for food. Send men east by wild trails. Send your need like a thief who knows all the doors. Pride kills less quickly than cold and more surely if you let it." "I have sent," he said. "Send again." She looked at him, and there was a softness there he trusted no more than he trusted the wall to speak. "I saw you die once," she said. "I saw you live. Men tell stories of both. Let them." "I would rather they told none," John said. "But I've forgotten the trick of that." At dusk that day, a rider came from Winterfell with Sansa's ring on rush cord about his wrist and Brienne's seal on wax that had cracked in the cold and been repaired clumsily. The letter's words were straight-backed and dense with things said and left unsaid both. "The North holds," it began, as if a woman had taken a house by the lintel and spoken to it until the wood smoothed under her hands. "The Boltons are broken. The Karstarks do not remember what it is to be wolves. We will teach them. The Umbers have choices to make that they cannot put off with lessons in loyalty taught to their sons over cups of fear. Come if you can. If you cannot, send me what I must have. Write truth. I can bear it. He wrote truth. He wrote of a night in which ice sang and a dawn in which it broke. He wrote of a sea that brought the dead as if they were a strange kind of tide weed. He wrote of the men he had killed because his oath had required it, and how his oath now had no shape except the shape of what lay north. He did not write of longing. He did not write of the moments he had, late at night, when he put his hand on the stone of the wall and pretended it was Winterfell's broken parapet, warm from the day's sun. In the months that followed, men learned. They learned how to hold a spear without bleeding their own palms. They learned to trust a wildling to catch them when the ice went under their feet on a rope bridge that had been mended twice since morning. They learned to sleep in shifts that did not feel generous and to eat when food was set out rather than when hunger suggested poetry about it. They learned to listen for a sound not like any sound a living thing makes. Jon learned too. He learned how to see. A snow in late light shows you the shape of things under it better than any noon could. The dead had that property too. They showed him his men's minds, where fear lay, where pride, where patience. He cut fear in half when he could and showed pride where to step and left patience to its work. He learned how to keep his own grief in a particular box and open it like a craftsman opens his kit for a simple, necessary job. He did not look too often at Ollie's face in memory, but he did not throw the memory away. He used it as a weight on the lid. Once or twice, alone by the parapet, he nearly laughed. He imagined what his father would say, or the man he had called father. He imagined Ned Stark's heavy kindness and the unyielding line of his mouth, the way he made even his gentleness stern by refusing to lie with it. He still could not quite call the man father without the ache that comes when one uses a word one has learned too late, but it was less of a wound than an old stitch that ached when it rained. At last the dead came again in their wisdom and their ruin. It was not the greatest battle of the war they were teaching the world to fight, but it felt to Jon like a test that a single man is given by a master who pretends not to watch. It came at the Shadow Tower where the stone was old and honest and less pretty than Castle Black, and Dennis Mallister had returned to it with a stubbornness Jon had learned to admire after disliking it a long while. The alarm went from mouth to mouth in clipped words that made men move because the time for singing was over. Jon went with Ed and Tormund and half the men who could still grip a hilt without their fingers complaining too loudly. They met the tide in a narrow place between two low rises where the wind had scoured the snow thin. The dead do not tire, but they still must climb, and men who make them climb do themselves a kindness. They hauled logs and chains and oil pots to places that were not quite right and made them right by cursing and lifting again without being asked. They propped up a length of old palisade and called it a wall because it wanted to be one that badly. When the dead came, Jon felt his fear go out in him like a candle in a room that has become suddenly bright. The others came later than the dead, as if they had learned that a man can be wearied past his cunning and wanted to speak to the cunning precisely. But Jon had not come to reason with ice. He had come to swing a sword and keep men alive long enough for the next bell to ring and the next one after that. Longclaw moved like a sentence he had memorized. Dragonglass broke through the lie that meat is the only thing that bleeds when struck. The winter sky stayed pitiless and the wind had a taste like pennies and old snow. In the middle of it, crouched behind what passed for cover, Dennis Mallister looked over at Jon and smiled a little and said, "You were a poor boy to command." "I was," Jon said. "You've outgrown it." Dennis lifted his voice and shouted at a man to hold his line and took an arrow into his shoulder for his trouble and did not fall. The blood soaked his cloak dark and froze there and cracked when he moved, which made him curse like a man much younger than he had any right to be. They held at the Shadow Tower. They held because they were too tired of not holding. They held because the dead had more patience but the living had more invention. They held because Ghost found the path between one moment and the next and taught Jon where to put Longclaw so that the world would give them back a little of the time it had taken. And when it was done, Jon stood with 1,000 small hurts and one large one he could not find in himself, and watched the snow take the mess again. He wanted to weep and found he had no tears the cold would not steal. He laughed instead, a short bark. Ed looked at him and nodded as if he had passed an exam Ed had always expected him to pass. Tormund thumped his back hard enough to remind him both that he was alive and that being alive was unkind to a man's ribs. He wrote Sansa. He wrote we held. He wrote winter still wants us but we want it back. He wrote I remember the gods would. Do you? He almost wrote I am tired. He wrote I am your brother. If that is not useful now, it will be later. Her answer came with a strip of green tied to it. A ribbon from some new garment some Winterfell woman had made with hands that were beginning to remember what gentleness could be. She wrote, we remember. She wrote, Bran lives. Jon stared at that word until the paper seemed to swell under his gaze and the ink too. He read the lines again and again, of a boy with a far gaze and strange friends, of a wolf who had never been tame and a home that was no longer a place but a kind of knowing. He read, Arya unknown. He read, Rickon lost. He read, you are needed where you are, and it both pained him and healed him to be told what he had told himself when his own voice had seemed untrustworthy. That night, alone, Jon went to the top of the wall and stood there in the stillness that is not silence. He looked north and saw only white and 1,000 shades of it, all of which meant different things a man could learn if he had time. He looked south and saw the soft spill of light that Winterfell sent into the night now, faint and ridiculous and brave. He could almost hear his father's voice telling him about a man's duty, and Cat's sharp tone telling him about a bastard boy in a good man's house, and Robb's laugh, and Sansa's careful scold, and Arya's careless one, and Bran's questioning, and Rickon's uncomplicated joy. He did not know what blood he had in him that the world thought mattered. He knew what he had left. A name that had turned into a thing men argued about and a vow that did not require them to. He spoke aloud because he thought perhaps a god might be listening or perhaps no one would, and that would be a relief. I killed men who meant to kill me, he said. I will kill dead things that mean to make us dead. I will hold this wall if it's the last thing men remember I did. I am Jon Snow, and I am the hand that holds, and that will be enough. Ghost came and pressed his head against Jon's hip, and Jon put a hand in the heavy fur and felt in the direwolf's warmth not comfort but companionship, which is better and more honest. He stood until the cold made a small moan in his joints when he turned, and then he went down and slept, and dreamed of nothing for once. Years later, if one could still count years in a place where seasons had lost their patience. Men spoke of a day when the wall held because a man who might have been king swung a sword himself when he had servants to do it for him, and hanged boys because his oath did not make his heart smaller but his duty larger. They spoke it in Winterfell under thick roofs, and in fishing huts where the wind was an uninvited ant, and in halls in the Vale where men liked to pretend the world was otherwise. They did not agree on whether Jon Snow had done right to keep his vow. Men rarely agree on right when famine and fear are still passing bread in the same bowl. But they agreed on this. When the dead came, he stood. That is a hard thing to agree on and to do. On a day lit clear and cruel, Sansa came north to stand with him on the wall. She wore a cloak bone white with a gray border, and her hair had a small streak of silver at the temple where the winter had reached into her early and left its mark as a favor. She stood and looked out and said nothing. He neither. There are not words for some places. At last she touched his arm. I thought, she said, that the execution would break you. It did, Jon said. He let the wind take the words, as if they were easier carried by something greater. But only at the places that needed breaking. You are hard to know. I am simple, he said. I have a wall. I hold it. She smiled, quick and private. That is not simple. It is only clear. He did not answer because he had heard a sound. A small one, a finch perhaps, had made a home in some nook of the stone where salt could not find it. Or perhaps he imagined it, because men who have held too long sometimes hear mercy where there is only a lapse in the weather's temper. He watched the white and the 1,000 shades of it and did not imagine that any god watched him watch. He watched because he had chosen to, and because choice is the only prayer that matters to the winter. Night came down. He put his hand on the stone. It had learned the shape of his hand by then. He imagined it missed him when he went below. He imagined Winterfell had a long memory and it would remember well enough for the both of them. He imagined a day when the dead would tire of their hunger and the living would tire of being afraid and the wind would speak in gentler sentences. He did not hope for it, not in the way a boy hopes for sweetmeats or a man for a victory. He simply thought, if it comes, it will find me standing. Jon Snow breathed smoke into the freezing air. Ghost leaned against him. The wall hummed its old note. Below, the men of the watch and the wildling kin they had taken and changed the watch and took their cups and told their ugly little jokes that made the dark blow warmer for a heartbeat. Far south, a woman with red hair wrote a letter and sealed it with a direwolf's head. Far north, a thing not a man tilted its head and listened for the pulse of the world. Between them, a sword in a scabbard waited, and a man's hand remembered the weight of it without bitterness. There is a kind of victory that looks from the outside like a long refusal. That night, the long refusal held.